the Point with Congressman Bill Pascrell, focusing on the concerns and issues facing the families of New Jersey's 9th Congressional District.
Hello, I'm Congressman Bill Pascrell, and I would like to welcome you to this latest edition of To the Point. In the early 2011, demonstrations erupted across Syria as part of the wider Middle Eastern protest movement known as the Arab Spring, with protesters demanding the resignation of President Assad amid calls for democracy and increased freedom. The Syrian army was deployed to suppress the uprising, which has since evolved into a bloody civil war. Sadly, the death toll is now approaching 100,000, according to the United Nations, with an estimated 1.4 million Syrians now refugees. In response, President Obama announced he will supply Syrian rebels with light arms in their war against the Assad regime, sparking an international debate on U.S. intervention. With me today are two experts on the front lines of this debate to discuss whether the United States is in a position to intervene in Syria as tensions continue to increase in the region and our military remains engaged in two wars of our own. Andrew Tabler is a senior fellow in the program on Arab politics at the Washington Institute, where he focuses on Syria and U.S. policy in the Levant. Mona Yacoubian is the senior advisor on the Middle East for the Stimson Center, where her work centers on the Arab uprisings with focus on Syria. I want to thank you both for To the Point, and thank you for being here today. You have two kind of different views about what we should be doing, what's in the best interest of the United States. We're going to start with Andrew. Has your mind changed, by the way, in the last 2 years, two years, since things have gone so badly, particularly in the last 2 months? Or are you basically at the same spot you were in 2011?
No. In 2011, I supported the administration's policy and of isolating the Assad regime, oil sanctions on the Assad regime, diplomatic isolation in terms of through the United Nations, and working through a UN process to support the peaceful protesters there. The problem that overall is that the United States has not achieved its objectives outlined by President Obama in August of 2011, in which he said President Assad had to step aside and we wanted a peaceful, democratic, and prosperous post-Assad Syria. That didn't occur. The uprising went armed after the Assad regime unleashed its full arsenal, at least in terms of qualitatively, on the Syrian people.
Well, you don't lay that at the door of the president, that Mr. Assad, our president, that Mr. Assad hasn't left. Resigned.
No, but I think that it was part of a policy prescription, and they remain the goals of the United States until this time. Now, other goals have been outlined, including laying down a red line on the use of chemical weapons in Syria, which our intelligence community has assessed have been used with a reasonable degree of certainty. So, Syria policy events in Syria have worsened. We're now looking at huge death tolls, very much akin to Bosnia, but in half the time. And so, therefore, I now advocate a more assertive approach to what's going on in Syria that involves U.S. intervention on a limited scale through defining the red line and enforcing it, safe areas, and working with the opposition.
Do you think, Mona, going back to this red line, do you think there's convincing evidence to show that the Assad regime used chemical weapons against the diverse group we call the rebels?
Right. Well, of course, I haven't had access to the evidence that they're using, but there is physiological evidence, and it's evidence that not only the United States believes that this was the case, but also several intelligence agencies, our allies in Britain, France, Israel, and Turkey as well.
But they have a huge stockpile of chemical weaponry, Syria. Does that change the dynamics of what we should be looking forward to and what we should be doing ourselves?
Well, I think the fact that Syria has a huge chemical weapons stockpile, and I think it's estimated to be maybe the third or fourth largest in the world, is why we need to pay such close attention to Syria.
Well, paying close attention to it is one thing. The stockpile remains there in a regime that's lucky to still be there in the first place. I mean, Syria is a pretty huge country, pretty big country, not necessarily population-wise. The rebels control part of it, vast amount of land, fewer people. The Assad regime controls the major cities, taking back one of those cities just recently. The rebels seem to be disorganized. I mean, does it ever get to the point, Mona, in your mind, if you were to advise, and you've advised other presidents on these issues in the Middle East, that we've gone over not only the red line, we've gone over the line and we need to do something militarily there to defend our own interests? And I'm going to ask you both in a few moments, what are our interests?
Well, I would say that one has to be flexible in terms of trying to understand the situation. I would never say never, that there's never an instance where military intervention in Syria would be prescribed. My sense is, at this time, military intervention does not make sense.
So you think basically military intervention by the United States, not that we're looking for, Americans are tired of being at war, but if we have to intervene, then we will intervene. And what you're talking about is a military intervention.
Well, let me take us a step back. My sense is that we are in a very deadly and protracted stalemate in Syria today. I think the regime has proven itself to be far more resilient, quite frankly, than any of us thought would be the case. I don't believe the solution to Syria, which is now a sectarian civil war, is ultimately going to be military. I think there's got to be a negotiated solution.
You've said there's no military solution.
There's no military solution, and I stand by that.
Do you believe there's a military solution?
But by military means alone, no. It has to be part of an overall package, and I think that military means in terms of laying down a red line.
Should we be intervening right now militarily in the United States?
To enforce the red line, I believe we should.
How would you do that?
Well, right off the bat, the White House in December of last year released to the New York Times its belief that Assad had loaded, for example, sarin into bombs on or near Syrian airfields. And so, for example, those bombs, since we know they're loaded, like a loaded gun, could be hit. Now, some of those airfields are in populated areas, so that wouldn't be wise. In such instances, then, the runways could be cratered so that they could not be delivered. These weapons, and other command and control could be hit. Right now, that would of course involve the use of U.S. aircraft or U.S. missiles.
So
we're not talking about boots on the ground.
military involved as well.
Yes, that would. I think in terms of the announcement a few weeks ago about the enforcement of the red line, that the Obama administration had recognized that indeed Assad had used chemical agents. It's the first time that I can find anyone, and I'm willing to be proven wrong, that a U.S. president's ever actually laid down a red line and then through its enforcement wasn't direct military action. It was actually announcing that they would increase military support for the rebels. Did not use the word lethal because we were already supporting the rebels anyway through military means.
Well, that's dubious. That's questionable. And when we say that we're supporting the rebels, how are we supporting the rebels? We're giving them light arms. Many of those arms,
I don't think we are.
Most of the arms have not been delivered.
Right.
Have not been delivered. And we know that the rebels are falling apart as it stands right. We just had a new leader for the rebel force, Jabbar. He's the new leader of the rebel force, yet the rebels are going in 15 different directions here. Al-Qaeda is involved in one area. These folks are involved. Hezbollah is fighting to protect the Syrian regime. Who do we give the weapons to, and how do we know that they're not going to be used? Hey, does this ring a bell? Oh, no, we're not going to use the weapons against us.
Right.
And which has happened time and time again. The American people are tired of hearing they were tired of hearing it in Iraq. The our weapons are being used against our guys and our gals, our sisters, our daughters, our brothers. How do we know that's not going to happen again?
Well, listen, I think that's a very good point.
That makes your point. You're
making my point, and I appreciate it. Let me elaborate on it.
I may not agree with it, but it makes your point.
Let me elaborate, because I think it's important for people to understand this. My own sense is that arming is not the way to go, in part because of the point you raised. How do we know? How can we guarantee they don't end up in the wrong hands? Also, though, from a civilian protection standpoint, arming is probably the worst option. Funneling arms into a chaotic conflict zone, like that which is the case in Syria, puts civilians at greater risk. We've been talking about the refugee flows, which now are being compared to the same level as in the Rwandan crisis.
But Mona, we could say that about every conflict, and therefore the United States can isolate itself and not get involved in anything.
No.
Now, there are some who believe that. You don't believe that, right, Andrew?
Well,
or do you?
No, I think that it's actually beyond just weapons, right? I mean, what the United States needs with the opposition is influence, right? And it needs influence because an enemy of the United States, the Assad regime, and it's supported by Tehran and by Hezbollah. They need.
We're going to talk about that.
They need to be pushed back. They need to be able to stop slaughtering civilians en masse, and they're doing that through conventional means. Now, the U.S. can provide weapons. It hasn't so far, only in a covert sense, really, but it hasn't so far. But there are lots of other things the United States could be doing to get an influence with the rebels, including training, which is apparently about ready to be ramped up, providing intelligence, and a whole host of other measures. But that would be within the realm of lethal, right? And so that decision has yet really to be made. And so that's where we are at the moment. Now, that can get us influence with the opposition, who we would like to take over a post-Assad Syria. And it's the guys on the ground who are taking the shots, and unfortunately they're mostly guys, but not all in terms of the other areas of Syria, that are going to be calling the shots in the areas that are liberated from Assad's forces.
Well, we got serious problems here, as you both have indicated. Hezbollah comes out of Lebanon, is joining the forces of President Assad to entrench him even further. We know that this revolution isn't going to end tomorrow morning. I mean, the rebels aren't going to decide that they're outgunned and outmanned and go home and hide in their tents. That's not going to happen, is it? No. We're going to continue. But isn't that part of our interest, Hezbollah? I mean, Hezbollah is out to destroy our allies in the Middle East. What does that say if we don't do anything? If we sit back and really it gets worse? Because it's not going to get better in and of itself, is it?
No.
I want you to hold there for a second. We're going to take a very brief break. We're going to come right back. Then I want you both to respond to that question.
We all share a common journey. We wanted to serve our country, stand for something bigger than ourselves, and protect the things we love. Although we were ready to face any mission, help those in need, and make a difference, for some of us, coming home was more of a challenge than we expected. In the service, we had each other's backs. But as veterans, it can sometimes feel like we're all alone, even when surrounded by our loved ones.
At the Veterans Crisis Line, we understand what you're going through, and we can help. It's your call.
This is your new kitten, or your new puppy. Every day, 70,000 puppies and kittens just like them are born in the U.S. Cute, right? Well, what's not cute is that half of all litters are accidents. And when a kitten has a litter of oopsies and a puppy has a litter of uh-ohs, pretty soon you have thousands and thousands of WTFs. And that leads to millions of pets being killed in shelters each year. But if 80% of pet owners say they believe in spaying and neutering, then what gives? Well, it turns out those sweet little fuzzballs can get pregnant sooner than you think. A lot sooner. But here's the good news. You can stop the accident before it happens. You just have to remember one number. 4, as in 4 months. When you bring home Maggie or Ruby or Puddle or Clyde, get them fixed at 4 months. It can be old enough to get pregnant, and it's definitely young enough to make a difference. Prevent more, fix at month 4.
And we're back here talking to Andrew Tabler and Mona Yacoubian, two people I consider experts in the field that we're talking about today, Syria and American involvement, interest, engagement, disengagement, wherever it may go. I threw out a question before we broke. I'd like to see hear both of your responses.
So I'll take a first stab. So
Go
you
ahead.
talked about Hezbollah entering the fray and basically stepping out of Lebanon and very actively getting involved in Syria, which is absolutely a development of real concern to the United States.
Very big concern.
Very
this
big
is
concern.
This is our definite enemy.
No question about it. And I think what it suggests is the ways in which this conflict has gotten much more complicated and frankly much more difficult to resolve, because you've got now Iran and its proxies now very much engaged in Syria. My sense is that it was that development that prompted the decision to decide to start providing light arms to the Syrian rebels, more so than the chemical weapons.
Probably.
And I think what it does is it underscores to us how it is that we can't walk away from Syria, we can't stand back. But again, my own sense is that ultimately the answer for this is going to have to be diplomatic. It might even mean, and I'm sure you're not going to want to hear this, but it may even mean thinking about ways to bring Iran into a broader discussion about Syria and where Syria goes.
What do you think, Andrew?
I think that the decision to do more in Syria was heavily influenced by the role of Hezbollah in the fight in Syria. This is unprecedented. I mean, I watched it. This has actually been going on for the better part of half a year. Hezbollah has been intervening in Syria in a sort of offset fashion from Lebanese territory. And
they helped take back the city of Qusayr.
That's correct. Now that was in direct fashion. The Assad regime is on the offensive with the help of Hezbollah troops and Iranian advisors and assistants, right? So that's a real issue. That's a real worry.
So number one, now we know other countries and other entities are involved. But what is very peculiar about this, in our perception of the Arab world, there is no such thing. Every country is unique. Not only they have different populations, but every country is unique. Some countries are Islamic imperialist. Some are simply monarchies holding on to a lifeline. And some countries don't know where they are. So the point of the matter is the Arab world is no different than it was 500 years ago. When we talk about if we don't talk about each country in its own uniqueness, Americans don't understand the perception of what the Arab or the Muslim world is all about. When we define it all as one universal, we goof. Would you agree with that?
Sure, we have a lot of different countries now in what is today what we consider the Middle East or the.
And there's no one enemy. There's no one country that's an enemy. It's kind of a growing imperialism that I see unfolding in front of me, which if one could say, if we don't stop it here, where are we going to stop it? Where's the ultimate red line?
Well, I think perhaps where you're getting at, and that is the borders of the current Middle East, which were set up after the First World War, largely. Right. There was some that existed
before. The Ottoman Empire was broken
Exactly. One of the big issues is the fight in Syria is no longer just about Syria. It's about the region, and it's about the proxy battle that goes on there. Now, and this is where people often say what happens in Syria is akin to what happened in Lebanon in the 70s and 80s. And for as horrific as everything that went on in Lebanon really was, and it was horrific, Lebanon was the small row house on the end of the block. And the fight there was constrained and sometimes even put out, at least temporarily, diplomatically and militarily, by the intervention of the two other row houses, Israel and a much different Syria with different demographics.
Right.
And that went on for 15 years, horrifically bloody, and in the end a solution through the Taif Accord that didn't satisfy everyone, but actually kept the peace and has kept the peace. Syria is different. Syria is geographically central. It is the row house in the middle of the block. So what happens there, it's very hard to contain it. And this is another big worry, that we've seen spillover effects in terms of refugees. Secretary Kerry yesterday visited the Zatari refugee camp in northern Jordan.
He's not giving up.
No, fourth largest city in Jordan now.
Right.
So quite frankly, that combined with Hezbollah activities across the Lebanese frontier, unfortunately, Syria isn't Vegas, right? What happens there isn't going to stay there.
Right.
Unfortunately, it is geographically central to that group of row houses. That group of row houses is the security architecture in the region. We don't have a lot of interest in Syria, but in the countries that surround Syria, NATO member Turkey, Iraq, where we've dumped billions, Jordan, where we've dumped a lot of money over and we have a lot of influence in Israel, and then of course Lebanon.
Dump may be the proper word too.
In some cases, unfortunately. Right. But anyways, we have a lot of investments around that in that security architecture. That also rubs up against our interests, and there are risks coming out of Syria because it threatens to increasingly spill over its borders and affect not only the borders in those countries, but the people who live there.
What do you think about that?
I totally agree. I mean, I think that's exactly right. I think that's why we've got to understand where this country is, where it's going. One thing I think we've got to bear in mind, though, is that what happened in Syria was part of this broader phenomenon known as the Arab Spring.
And what is that about? It's about average people want democracy.
Exactly.
They want to be heard. The internet has changed everything. China realized that. They're not worried about our bombs. They're worried about their folks looking at what's happening in the United States and finding out the truth once in a while.
Well, there's no question social media played a role, no doubt about it. But I also think it's about exactly what you said. Normal people, just like Americans, wanting to live their lives freely, having aspirations for themselves, wanting to have opportunities in the future. And this was an Arab world that really, for decades, had been under the
If we intervene, no, let me ask you this. If we intervene, do we become more of the enemy of the Muslim people, or do we become those who, we're laying down this red line, you're not going to cross it? What happens?
This is a struggle of the Arab people, ultimately. We
didn't
have
answer
to bear
my
that.
question.
I don't think we should be intervening. I think if we intervene militarily, certainly not boots on the ground, you end up, in fact, putting yourself in as a protagonist in ways that really don't make sense. And these are organic struggles.
Well, that could have been said in Iraq, too.
Well, that's exactly right.
That's a good argument for not being involved in Iraq. Forget about the weapons of mass destruction, all that other stuff.
Well, I think
one of the best reasons was that we become engaged, then when we become involved, and then we can't get out of it.
Well, it's the Pottery Barn rule.
Yeah.
You break it, you own it. And I think there are important lessons to bear in mind.
Well, if we don't stop them there, we'll have to stop at the shores and the Hudson River. How about that?
Exactly.
By the way, that was one of the things that was stated in the Iraq debate, that if we don't stop them here, they're going to come over. I mean,
well, I think spillover is not likely to hit the Hudson directly, but one of the big worries is that in all the areas that Syria is now effectively broken into three parts, and we have the Assad regime-controlled area. In which Hezbollah is playing a very central role.
Think they're a new country themselves.
Exactly, Kurdish area and an area for the Sunni Arabs. Now, so in each one of those areas, we have now U.S. designated terrorist groups that are ascendant. I'm not saying they control everything. I'm not even saying they're the majority, but they are all on the offensive in one way or the other. That's not good for the that's not good for the United States. Now, what's interesting about the Pottery Barn rule here is that this is just the way it goes. Sometimes, even if you didn't break it, you still have to buy into the cleanup, because if your row houses border those, or your allies' row houses border that place that's on fire.
This is a message to you, Mona.
I'm hearing it. Yes,
it becomes the problem is you get involved in containing it. Right. So I don't ultimately think we can. Mona's right. These are organic struggles that have to do with demographics, inelastic regimes, and really bad governance. Right. What we're looking at here is not necessarily solving the Syria crisis. I don't think we can solve it. Right. But I think that we can help contain it. I think we can help shape it. Some of those measures, some of those instruments are military in nature. And over time, by the way, this conflict, by my estimates, and I think Mona, I think she'll probably agree, is going to go on for a very long time. We don't know how long, but this is not going to go away tomorrow or next year, or even maybe even 5 years from now. I think this will continue to play out, and there could be military aspects to this for the United States over time.
I mean, this is not a holy war by any stretch. Like Bin Laden started
it's increasingly
a holy
sectarian.
war.
It's a sectarian war.
It's a sectarian war.
So religion plays a role.
And different in every country, it's different too. How religion plays a different role.
But yeah, absolutely.
We have to understand that.
No question. But if I could go back to what Andrew was saying, because we do largely agree, and I think in no way am I advocating that the U.S. should be walking away from Syria. I think we very much agree on the analysis. I think the question is, how does the U.S. influence? How does the
just giving humanitarian aid?
Well, humanitarian aid is very important.
Well, to the refugee, I've been in refugee camps. I know how bad and the situation could be. I can't imagine what's going on in Turkey or Lebanon or Jordan. I can't imagine what those camps must be like. And those poor people. I come from the city of Paterson, New Jersey. I've always had a tremendous amount of Syrian people. Long before the Palestinians landed, the Syrians were there. Many of them Christians. And we know how they were treated. But you know, many of the Christians in Syria think that Assad was their godfather. He protected their backs, their backsides. But you want to know something? He was killing other people while he was doing that. I mean, he's a bad actor. He needs to go. But we have no right to say get out, do we? Do we have a right to say get out? Or is the United States decides who the good dictators are and who the bad dictators are?
We always have policy goals that we set out. Now the question is, it's not just whether we want him to go. Of course we want him to go. President Bashar al-Assad has been a disastrous president for Syria. He'll never rule over the entire country again. I can't see it. After you fire over 350 surface-to-surface missiles on your own population, you don't come back from that politically. It's really, really hard, right? Now, but the question is, what is the United States willing to do? What are the risks of doing that? And when do you do it? And I think those are the questions that are currently being worked out. And you know, whether it's in the White House or in the bureaucracy, and they will continue to be worked out because this conflict is not going to be over anytime soon.
And if I could just add to what Andrew just said, I think the other key question is, as you're evaluating these various options, and all of them are and should be on the table, does the option that you're considering improve, ameliorate the situation, or hold the potential for making it worse? And I think for me, that's where military intervention.
So if I have to vote tomorrow morning, Mona, if I have to vote tomorrow morning, the Congress does vote once in a while on some things that are important. If I have to vote tomorrow morning, the question is, we're going to supply heavy military arms to certain of the rebels in Syria to lessen the bloodshed.
No, I don't see how that happens.
An oxymoron.
No, right.
Do I vote yes or no?
I think you should vote no.
Well, how would you want me to vote?
I think you should vote yes. Well, of course, it would depend on the details of what was outlined to you. Here we're talking about supporting the Supreme Military Council, which is the sort of armed affiliate of, of the Syrian opposition. Now, I would ask a lot of questions. We have a lot of Salafists which are inside of that organization. And we've also had a lot of problem with leakage of weapons that have been delivered so far. By the way, we wouldn't be alone.
Andrew?
So, yes, I would.
You sound like a congressman now. Go ahead. You would supply.
I would supply, but again, it would depend on the details.
Okay, look, our time is ended. I've got 14 more questions, but obviously I'm not going to be able to ask them. I really appreciate the fact that both of you took the time for this. People have to be clued in. They got to read about this. They're not going to read about it if it's on page 38. So I want to thank you both for participating, to educate me, to educate the public, and how we should make decisions that are well informed. Thank you so much, Mona. Andrew, thanks again.
Thank you.
Look, thank you for watching the edition to The Point. You've heard our thoughts. Now I would like to hear what you think about today's show. If you have any comments or concerns or questions, stay tuned. Our address, phone number, and website address will appear in a moment. Thanks again for tuning in. We'll see you next time on To The Point.